Hey everyone, Joshua Gibson here with episode 67 of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. Before we get started, I'd like to give a quick shout out to the show's sponsors, BarShield and First Attempt Lifting. BarShield created a maintenance kit designed to prevent rust and restore spin to a barbell's sleeves. My discount code, PWPodcast, gets you 10% off your entire purchase, and it will also help me to continue producing great podcasts with amazing guests. Head over to barshieldUSA.com, pick up a kit, and get your bars looking and spinning like new. I've also recently partnered with Matt Bergeron of First Attempt Lifting to get you guys 10% off of any diet or digital coaching service. Matt's approach mirrors mine in that it focuses on principles instead of methods. Don't believe me? Go check it out at firstattemptlifting.com and help support the show and support your own goals. Use the code PWPodcast_diet for any nutrition service or PWPodcast_lift for any online programming option. That's it for the long-winded intro. Let's get on to this week's podcast with Matt Foreman. Welcome to another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm joined today by Matt Foreman. Most of you may know him from his Catalyst Athletic articles, which I think does a disservice to his background as an athlete and a coach, which is why I am very excited to have him on. So Matt, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Josh. I appreciate it.
Yeah, not a problem at all. So before we started recording, we were talking a bit about what your plans are now, getting back into weightlifting, but I'd like to take a few steps back and talk about how you got into the sport, and then we can kind of get back up to this point.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, the way I got into the sport was I had a little bit of a roundabout, interesting road. I grew up in a little small town way up in northern Arizona where there was no weightlifting activity, no gyms, no coaches, no nothing like that. There was only one weight room in the whole town, and it was my high school weight room. And I was a football player, and this is a kind of the typical part of the story is football players were required to lift for being on the team. And just through reading magazines that I bought at the supermarket at the time, like Muscle and Fitness and Ironman and whatnot, I found out about powerlifting, and it sounded like a pretty cool thing to try because I was pretty good in the lifts and pretty strong. So I started competing in powerlifting just on my own, no coach, no guidance, no training partners. I worked out by myself at, every day before school in the high school weight room. And I did powerlifting for 2 years and did really well at it as a high schooler. I broke something like 23 state records in 2 years and won the state championship twice and won the high school national championship my junior year. But then right around that time, I remember it was 1988, and I saw Olympic weightlifting on TV for the first time at the '88 Olympics. It's when Naeem Suleimanoglu did that unbelievable performance at 60 kilos. And then later that year, I remember the Leonid Taranenko's big super heavyweight clean and jerk record was on ESPN also. And so, I had absolutely no idea how to do Olympic lifting. I knew it was really technical. I knew you needed somebody to teach you how to do it, but I kind of said, I'm going to try it anyway. So I just started going to my high school weight room and started trying to figure out how to do snatches and clean and jerks on my own, just with iron plates, power bars, concrete floor, no bumpers and everything like that. And just basically try to learn myself that way. And I entered a meet just kind of on a whim down in Phoenix. 1990 was the year I competed my first meet, and I think I snatched 80 kilos and clean and jerked 100 kilos, which, I was in the 90 kilo class at the time. So, nothing important in terms of the weights, but there was a coach at that competition at my first meet who was one of the coaches for the national junior squad at the time. And he noticed me. He noticed I was pretty strong kid at the time, because even though my lifts weren't huge, I was already through powerlifting, I had deadlifted around 550 at the time and squatted over 500. So he could kind of see that. And so he kind of approached me and took an interest in me and asked me if I wanted learn a little bit more about the sport and everything like that. And he asked me for my address. He said he would send me some stuff about the sport. And I didn't know if the guy was like legit or real or if he was like a child predator or whatever. So I just gave him my address. And then a couple of months later, he did send me a big package with, a bunch of weightlifting magazines and some videos on VHS and some information about the sport. And so I started getting into it. And then, a while later, I got asked to go out to the Olympic Training Center in 1990 and compete to train with the national junior squad there in Colorado Springs. And I mean that junior squad was kind of a historical camp, between all Wes Barnett and Vern Patao and Tim McRae and just kind of a laundry list of the great U.S. lifters of the 90s, who were all, juniors at the time getting started. And that was also the summer that Nico Vlad of Romania was out there. He was spending a summer in the United States training with his coach, Dragomir Sorosolan, who went on to become our national resident coach for 15 years after he, kind of got the offer from the USOC. And after that camp, I would say when I drove out of Colorado Springs at the end of that camp, I pretty much knew that this is what I wanted to do with my life. So that kind of went from there. I lifted for a couple years down here in Arizona. I was going to Northern Arizona University for college at the time, and weightlifting wasn't going anywhere for me. I was getting better and I was making progress, but not the kind of progress I thought I needed to make. And then John Thrush, the coach of the Calpian Weightlifting Club up in Washington, who at the time he was probably the most successful and well-respected coach in the country. He had seen me at junior nationals and knew who I was from that camp at Colorado Springs, and he basically kind of like recruited me to move up to Washington and lift for his club. And so I moved up there when I was 20, and that was kind of it. I lived up there for 12 years and, had a big career and, got to be a part of the great things we had with that club at the time. So that's kind of how that's the long version of how the whole thing got started,
Yeah. And out of curiosity, you mentioned a few names there, so I'm sure you might pick one of them, but as far as the biggest influences on you as a coach, who would you say you've drawn the most from?
Well, John, definitely. John Thrush was my coach from the time that I was, obviously, 19, 20 up until, so I still consider him my coach. I left Washington in 2004 and moved back here to Arizona just because I was, getting older and wanted to be closer to my family and their older years and everything. So, but I still, when I register with USA Weightlifting, I still list my club as the Calpian Weightlifting Club, and I still list John Thrush as my coach. His influence on me as a coach I'm 46 years old now and haven't lifted with John for 15 years, but I still consider him my coach, and I'll always consider him my coach, and I'll be a part of his club as long as the club is in existence. So him definitely, and Dragomir Sorosolan, former bronze medalist for Romania, who became our national resident coach here in the U.S. from 1990 through I think like 2004. I never personally lifted for Dragomir, but it's during those years in the 90s when I was kind of on the national scene and. It kind of felt like we were all part of the same organization and part of the same team, I guess, because, I competed against all of Dragomir's lifters. I knew him really well. He knew me really well. We were always at all the same meets. We always, shared a lot of the same experiences and stuff. And it was kind of an interesting situation watching guys like that because, John, my coach, was a really, if you've never met John, he's a really soft-spoken, reserved, quiet kind of coach, and Dragomir is just like a firecracker, just real explosive and just intense and everything like that. And the kind of the two opposite ends of the spectrum were kind of like I guess both of them together were kind of big parts of my development during those years.
Okay, and I recently actually recorded a podcast with Chris LaRue, and he kind of shares that same background working at the OTC and then also training with John Thrush. Did you ever get a chance to train with Chris?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Chris was at that camp in 1990, that junior squad camp that started it all, and yeah, Chris actually was a member of the Calpian Club for I think most of the 90s. He came out and trained with us in Washington for maybe a year prior to the 96 Olympic trials. So yeah, Chris was he was definitely a close part of our group.
So how did and I've posed this question to a few different people who have experience. I don't want to say experience, but were part of the weightlifting scene before and after the big, I guess, information boom with the introduction of the internet and all of the articles and materials that have been put out by other coaches. So, as far as what weightlifting was like before that, I'm assuming it was much different because you moved to live with a coach. You spent a lot of time learning under that coach. Not a lot of competing influences or interests from other people. And then after the fact, like looking at it now, it's so easy just to bounce around, synthesize information from other people, and create like a unique method or program of programming or training the lifts. So, in your opinion, what was it like before the big information boom, and then after the fact?
You know, when I started, obviously, I mean, this is really like making me sound old, but I started weightlifting before the internet even existed, obviously, and I was already kind of on the national scene when the internet, was invented, I guess. And, all of my big lifting, in the 90s, was, I mean, the internet didn't really, wasn't really like, hadn't really developed by the that 1998, 1999, 2000. I mean, obviously it existed, but not like it does now, and it hadn't touched weightlifting yet. And all this weightlifting, the boom you're talking about, hadn't even come close to happening. And so, to answer your question, here's the thing: back in those days, there was no internet to get on to find coaches. The only way to find coaches was to actually be on the weightlifting scene, meaning going to meets, going to nationals every year and stuff like that. And the only way that you could actually find out who the good coaches were by going to the meets and actually, visually seeing the coaches who were producing the big time lifters. There was no social media. There was no Facebook. Coaches didn't put themselves out there publicly and advertise their services on the internet. Things like that just didn't exist. So the only way to know who the good coaches were to go to the big meets and see who was pumping out the best lifters. So there weren't many coaches. I mean, I lived in Arizona, and to get to the coach that I knew could kind of take me to the next level, I had to pack up all my stuff in my car and move 5 states away up there to Washington State. I mean, it was hard to find a good coach back in those days. Now there were coaches. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like there weren't, coaches in the area. There was, I was coached by a guy in Arizona those first couple of years before I moved up to Washington. But you could really see the separation between the real coaches and the posers, I guess you could say. Back in those days, when you went to the national championships or the American Open or University Nationals or Junior Nationals or whatever, I mean, it was a situation where you spent the weekend at the meet, you competed, you hung around the meet, you watched all the competition and everything like that. And you would see coaches like John Thrush and Gail Hatch and Steve Goff and Bob Takano and obviously Dragomir. And these guys were in the warm-up room and standing at the chalk box with all the best lifters in the country. So there was no situation where you went on social media and some guy was soliciting himself as a coach, trying to recruit you to come lift for him in his CrossFit, with no real accolades or no real accomplishments, just kind of like a bunch of self-promotional stuff that he put together for himself. I mean, I guess the shortest way to say it is to become established as a coach and to really have success as a coach. I mean, you really had to be the real deal back in those days, because the only way that there was for anybody to even know about you was through your results, through your athlete production at the national level. And if you didn't have that, then nobody literally even knew who you were. There was no way for them to know who you were, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's becoming a little more difficult with the influx of great athletes into the sport. People that have maybe played collegiate football or basketball, or maybe they swam in college, and they have just this natural affinity for physical movement. And coaches see that, and they're able to recruit through those methods and then create a pretty good team. So to me, that kind of begs the question, what's the difference between a good and a great coach now that the talent pool is growing and people have access to just, freaks of nature?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing about that. A great coach is somebody who can take athletes. Let me back up a little way. A great coach is somebody who sets up their own program, establishes their own program, has their own gym, runs their own team, runs their own club, and they stay in one place for a long period of time. They run their program, stay in their gym for a long period of time, and throughout that long period of time, they consistently produce athletes at a high level over long stretches of time, different names, different time periods, different situations, just whatever, for years and years, this person is just always going to have lifters up there near the top. If you look at a guy like John Thrush, John started coaching sometime in the 80s. And, he still coaches up to now. I think the peak of our club was probably the year 2000. And, he obviously continued coaching at the national level for some years after that. But, for 15 years, John Thrush was just always going to have lifters up there at the top at the nationals. Men, women, heavyweights, lightweights, middleweights, whatever, different names, lifters came and go. I mean, it just... whatever the situation, he was just going to keep producing high-level athletes. And the thing about him is he was going to get big results out of athletes regardless of the level of, kind of natural ability that they had. We definitely had some freak show athletes during that time. We had some athletes that were, tremendously physically talented, but we also had athletes in our club that were, that they weren't freak show athletes. They had talent, they had ability, but nothing insane, nothing that would like make you look at somebody the first time you ever saw him and think, oh my God, this person's going to break a world record someday. But he would still get athletes up to that level. So a great coach is somebody who can just elevate anybody. That's a great coach. Nowadays everything has changed so much. Coaching is more about recruiting now. It's more about looking for athletes who, kind of immediately, obviously to everybody, have like this kind of a fantastic ability to achieve at a high level, and figuring out a way to get that person on your club. And this is what's happening more often, I think, coaches looking for athletes who have been developed by somebody else, and basically just trying to find a way to lure them onto their club. We've got a situation now, and it's I don't know, it's not a situation I feel real good about in USA weightlifting, where like a lot of the top clubs that are out there and a lot of the top weightlifting programs that are out there are being run by coaches who have almost no kind of really substantial or important weightlifting resume to speak of. If they're former competitors, they didn't do anything important enough for anybody to know about. And they also, haven't really developed anybody. It's more like we've got coaches that are just setting up shop and then figuring out these creative ways to like entice other athletes onto their team. And sometimes we're talking about athletes that were like kind of elevated and developed by somebody else who probably is, kind of a better coach, because they were able to like move the person up the ranks from the beginning. So that's definitely happening right now. It's more of a marketing type of thing. And on top of that, it's happening in conjunction with the fact that you can make money doing this now. There's money out there for athletes, and a lot of coaches and programs have money to offer athletes. And the thing about weightlifting is, when you're an elite level weightlifter, you're going to be young. You're going to be younger than 25, right around there, or somewhere, kind of in your mid 20s. And you're not going to have a full time job. And you're not going to have any money. You're going to be broke. That's part of being a great weightlifter. And so if somebody comes up and dangles, some money in front of you and says like, hey, I can offer to pay your travel expenses. I can put you on some kind of a monthly stipend or something like that. You're going to be looking to go. I definitely would have when I was young. I mean, now nothing would have made me leave John Thrush, but before I met John, if I would have been like a young up and coming kid who didn't really have any allegiance to anybody as a coach, and somebody would have dangled money out there, I mean, that would have been a pretty powerful factor. It would have had to be,
Yeah. So to an athlete that is maybe in that position, what advice would you give to them? Is it just a matter of join the team that can best support you as a weightlifter? Is it, I mean, that's kind of a sticky situation to be in where you're used as a marketing tool to support someone's business, but then that gives you an opportunity to focus on weightlifting.
Yeah. Well, if I was going to give advice to a young weightlifter, I would say when you're looking for a coach, first of all, don't think about money too much. Look for a coach who's proven. And when I say proven, I'm talking about somebody who has an actual credible track record of production at a high level. Look for that first, because if you go somewhere just based on money with a coach who isn't proven, you're probably not going to wind up getting the ultimate top level results that you're capable of. Because you're going to go someplace that's got opportunities for you, and you're going to be able to have the money that they're promised you and everything like that. But that coach isn't going to have the goods that are required to move your total up 20 kilos, to kind of like take you from being like a second, third, fourth place national level finisher to being like a first place world teamer type of thing, So I would say first look for a coach who's proven. And I would also tell them, look for a situation where you've got a really good environment. One of the reasons why we had so much success back in those days with the Calpian Club is because we just had such an incredible gym with so much environment. Any given day that you walked into our gym, you were going to see a half dozen people who were either world team members, national champions, second, third, fourth place at nationals. I mean, it was just a gym where it was just a very high level nationally competitive program. And so that atmosphere elevates your performance. When you're around great lifters, you're going to elevate your own performance to kind of like be great and fit in with them, So I would say look for those things. I would say, look for money last. If the money's there, it's a perk and everything like that. But if you look for the money first, you can very easily find yourself in a situation where you're not going someplace that's ultimately gonna make you into the type of weightlifter you need to be at the end.
Yeah, that's really insightful. And kind of to flip that question, I guess, towards the coaching aspect, if we're talking to someone who is maybe starting out, maybe they didn't have a natural affinity towards the sport, or they weren't just as gifted, how do they become proven? Because obviously you have to start somewhere and then develop yourself. So what does the process of a coach's development kind of look like?
Well, yeah, that's boy. These are really, really good questions you're asking, by the way. The thing about that is one of the problems we've got nowadays, and I don't know, maybe it's not even a problem, but it's definitely something that gets on my radar, is that people these days in weightlifting want to become coaches like almost immediately after they've started the sport. They have very, very little experience or time served as athletes, and they immediately want to become coaches. That's kind of a tough one, because here's the thing: you don't need to have been a world team member or an Olympian or a national champion to be a great coach, but you do need to have been a weightlifter. At some level for a sustained period of time. You have to have that if you really, really want to be a great coach. Now, you don't have to have that if you're just looking to score athletes based on money and recruiting, then it doesn't matter. But if you really want to be the kind of coach that's going to establish greatness by developing and making athletes great, you have to have an understanding of what it means to be a weightlifter. And I don't mean just an understanding of how to do the snatch and clean and jerk. I mean an understanding of what it means to be a weightlifter. Because there are a lot of people out there that, they know how to perform a snatch and a clean and jerk, and they know how to teach a snatch and a clean and jerk. But that is a whole world of difference from knowing how to be a weightlifter. And I'm talking about living the life, going through all the things you have to go through in this sport, enduring all the things you have to endure, and also understanding the process that has to go through, that you have to go through to become a great weightlifter. If you want to be a great coach, you have to have lived that for a length of time. Even if you didn't live it, at the Olympic level, you have to have lived it, and you have to learn during that time. You have to put in a long body of learning. Personally, I started competing in weightlifting, like I said, when I was, 17, 18 years old in 1990. I mean, I didn't even start really coaching weightlifting until, I don't know, kind of the mid to late 90s, because I honestly didn't consider myself qualified to coach until then. I knew snatch and clean and jerk. I mean, obviously I was a pretty good lifter, and I certainly knew how to set up a program. But when I looked at what my coach did, and I'm talking about all the intangibles coaches have to do, I knew that I wasn't ready to do that. I didn't have those kind of skills, and then at some point as a coach, you do just have to jump in and get started. At some point you do just have to set up shop and get started. And coaching it's a lot like weightlifting. It's a skill that really, really takes a long time to develop. You're going to be a better coach at year 6 than you were at year 2. And you're going to be a better coach at year 20 than you were at year 11. It takes a long time, and you got to work with a lot of athletes of all different skill levels. That's the thing these days. A lot of coaches, like I said, through recruiting, are just looking to score, obviously, the most talented athletes out there. And some of these athletes that we're talking about, when you look at an athlete like CJ Cummings or Harrison Morris or Kaiser Witt, I think is how you pronounce his last name, the new kid, super heavyweight kid. These guys are the type of athletes who, and I'm not saying this to discredit their coaches at all, not whatsoever, but these guys are so talented, it almost wouldn't matter who was coaching them. They could probably be coached by a wide range of people, and they'd still be producing those results because they're just better than everybody. They were born better than everybody. They're more talented than everybody, and so they're going to beat everybody. I think that, and that's that is kind of a truth of this sport. I can tell you, after 30 years of being in this, that's not a shot at a coach, and that's not a disrespect towards anybody, but that is one thing I've learned in weightlifting through a lifetime of doing it. There are some athletes out there that have so much natural ability and so much talent that they can be trained using a wide range of programs by a wide range of people, and they're still going to go out there and be better than everybody because that's just what they have, Yeah. So that kind of that's another part to think about it. So I know we've kind of gotten away from your question a little bit, but so the things I think to make you a great coach is I think time served is a big one, and then as a coach, I really think in the early years, man, you gotta take all comers. Everybody who comes to you, old, young, talented, not talented, whatever. I think every single bit of that, because if you've got an athlete who's got very little ability and very little talent, but they're committed and they want to be a weightlifter, and you spend 2-3 years working that person up and making them into a better lifter than they ever were before, even if they never wind up reaching a high level, you've really strengthened yourself as a coach just from having done that with them.
Yeah, and it's very rewarding. I think to see someone that, maybe from a mobility standpoint, their body just isn't shaped in a way that allows them to hit the right positions, to be able to maximize results, to be able to get them into a full depth overhead squat is like a win in and of itself, and it can take a lot of time. Whereas, yeah, when you talk about the great athletes, it's throw them a training program that's 10 kilos on their squat in 4 weeks. And
Yeah.
it didn't seem like you really had to do much, but you can become inflated with your own methods and think, wow, I've got the sauce. But what's interesting to me, and kind of hearing you talk about this, I've been trying to wrap my head around the theory and then the practice of weightlifting. So in theory, you start to understand how to program the technical models you need to use to develop a weightlifter, and then in practice, being able to apply all of those different methods. And that's, yeah, it's a skill in and of itself. But then you talk about the intangibles of a coach. What are those intangibles? I mean, obviously, a few come to mind, but I'd like to hear them, from your perspective.
Well, I think one of the intangibles is understanding the stages of weightlifting development an athlete goes through, and you can only understand that if you've lived the life as an athlete, because you kind of look at weightlifting as a sport where if you want to be a top level performer at whatever level, national level, state level, whatever, if you want to kind of like be one of the best in whatever level you're trying to get to, weightlifting is a stand in line and wait your turn kind of sport. If you come into the sport and you like, let's say you're a guy in kind of one of those middle or upper weight classes, you're like a 94, 105, 85 kilo lift or whatever, and you come into the sport and you after your first year, you're snatching whatever, 95, 100 kilos and clean and jerking 125 or 130 or something like that. And you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to make it my mission in life to eventually, snatch 125 and clean and jerk 155 and go to the American Open or the Nationals and like maybe compete in one of the upper sessions. If that's what you want, and if that's what you think if that's what you are going to plan to do, right, that's going to require a very long commitment. I mean, you're not going to make that progress in a year and a half. You might not make that progress in 3 years. And you have to look at the sport, and you have to look at your life. And if you're willing to say to yourself, okay, if this takes 10 years, I'll give it 10 years, then that's when you're a real weightlifter, And one of the intangibles as a coach is just knowing all of that and understanding all of that and being able to like work an athlete through that and tell them the things over time and remind them the things over time they need to know to keep them going when they're going through all of that, because weightlifting is a sport it's very easy to quit because it's just so damn hard. And I mean, when a person has gone through, well, like, let me give you an example. When I was kind of coming up in weightlifting, I reached a 300 kilo total by the time I was, about 21, in the old 99 kilo weight class, and then, so I thought I was going great guns. I mean, I was totaling 300 at a young age and, having a lot of success already. And then for 2 years after that, I mean, my total plateaued. I barely made any progress, had a couple of bomb outs, had a couple of injuries. I mean, it was a very long 2-year stretch of just failure and lack of progress. But the thing about it is because I was led by a coach who understood, look, this is just how it goes sometimes. This is just part of this is part of the game. I mean, this is how this sport is. I kind of kept that understanding in the back of my mind. And I kind of realized that bad meets, bad periods of time, lack of progress, bomb outs, none of those things are the end of the world. They're part of how this whole thing works. You're going to have that stuff if you're a weightlifter. You're going to have to go through that. So that's one of the intangibles. One of the other intangibles is being able to coach somebody mentally and coach somebody's personality. Because that's a really, really tough one with weightlifting, because like I said, all great weightlifters, and I'm not talking about people who are successful at the master's level. I'm talking about like kind of the real thing, if you want to put it that way. They're all going to be young. They're all going to be in their 20s. Most of them are going to have very little life experience outside weightlifting, and they're all going to be just full of aggression, just full of intensity, full of drive. And a lot of times they're going to be people who, don't think things through and don't look at everything before they make decisions. And, being able to coach somebody's personality through that is a really hard thing to do, especially when, you've got a program with 10, 15 people in it, and they're all very different individuals. You can't just have one method of coaching somebody mentally and coaching somebody's personality. You've got to have a method that suits each athlete, so things like that are important. And also I think one of the other intangibles is just your ability to keep running your program successfully in the face of adversity in your own life, because as a weightlifting coach, you're going to have, while you're trying to run your program, you're going to have your own set of difficulties, financial, personal life stuff. You're absolutely going to have time periods of doubt and frustration, and time periods where you just, I make a joke sometimes, you're not a real coach until you've had the move to the woods fantasy, where you think to yourself, like, I would like to just shut everything down, fire everybody, burn down the building, and throw everything in my backpack and move to the woods and have everybody leave me alone. You're not a real coach until you've gone through that. Because this sport can, it can be just as hard as a coach as it can be as a weightlifter. A weightlifter, when you spend 2 years getting injured, having bomb outs, not making progress, the whole time you're going through that as a lifter, your coach is going through it too, and your coach is blaming themselves because they think it's their fault that you're not having more success. They think that your lack of success is their fault. And that can really, that can wear you down over time. It really can.
Yeah, that's kind of funny. And what came to mind right then is actually Greg Everett, because that's kind of what he managed to do.
Yeah, Greg literally just did move to the woods. Yeah.
It kind of brought on a few questions as far as coaching athletes go. When you have a good athlete, somebody that maybe will qualify for nationals and compete at a lower level, maybe medal, and then you have a great athlete, in your opinion or in your experience, what is the difference between coaching those two athletes? Because I'm sure the great athletes, they know they're good. And do you see differences in personalities between the athletes that are at the top?
Yeah, very often you do. The athletes who are at the top, well, differences from a coaching perspective, athletes who have got like those types of gifts that we're talking about, those CJ Cummings type of gifts. One of the big things to do is to not overcoach them. Because if you try to do too much with them, you could very easily wind up taking them away from just what they know how to do naturally, and you can actually hold them back. So I think not overcoaching them is a big part of it. You've obviously got to manage them. You've got to give them the right program, the right kind of guidance, the right kind of training. But if you've got somebody who's got like Harrison Morris level ability, as a coach, you can't be up that guy's ass like every single moment of every single day, trying to like give him input and trying to give him coaching and trying to change things and trying to refine things, because he's going to get frustrated and overwhelmed, and he's going to be thinking to himself like, look, I already know how to do this, so just let me do it. I think that's a part of it. And as far as the personalities go, yeah, definitely. most elite level athletes out there, they've got a lot of pride and ego and self-respect and kind of a very high opinion of themselves. And I say those things in a good way. Not to, some athletes they're outwardly arrogant and they're crappy to be around and they're kind of, lousy personalities. But most of them aren't. Most of them are pretty solid people, but deep down inside, they see themselves as being better than everybody at this. They always see themselves as having much more in their tank than they maybe actually do. I coach athletes who, are kind of like lower level competitors, people who snatch, 80 kilos, 85 kilos in the middleweight men's classes after having trained for 2 or 3 years. And they're not really thinking about their weightlifting career and saying to themselves, like, yeah, I'm going to snatch 105 in 2 years. Great athletes will always think like that. They're always going to have this instinct that they're capable of more, they're ready for more, and they're always going to think they can do more. And so they're always going to have that kind of attitude about it. And they're also going to be people who probably have a lot less fear than other people. And that's not to say that you're not going to have a lot of elite level athletes who have fear in them, because a lot of them do. I mean, you'll even find a lot of elite level athletes, maybe not a lot, but you'll find some who are underconfident people, who are people who have major battles with like self-respect and everything like that. I don't mind telling you, I've trained with some athletes over the years that were massively successful, international level, American record holding type athletes who internally, in terms of their own personality, I mean, they were train wrecks, just real train wrecks. But at the end of the day, they had the physical tools, and despite all of their own personality shortcomings, they still had that just caginess, that kind of relentless, attitude, desire, competitiveness. They might have had very little ability to manage their life successfully in other ways, but they, at the end of the day, they were still tigers, and obviously they had the physical tools too.
And I've had on plenty of very successful athletes, very successful coaches, and a common thread amongst all of them is what you just said, their lack of fear, in that they're willing to drop everything, quit their jobs, move somewhere else and just train. Or they're willing to go under a bar that injures them and maybe negatively impacts their career, but they didn't have the fear to kind of prevent that from happening. And kind of hearing that in your own story with you traveling from Arizona up to John Thrush's gym, do you think that's something that people should try to work towards as an athlete? Because obviously fear in a sport where you're trying to jump under heavy weight day in and day out is something that can impede your performance. But how do you go about reducing somebody's fear or anxiety and help them, succeed that way?
Yeah, God, what a great question, and what a huge question too. Sometimes when it comes to reducing somebody's fear, a person's internal level of fear, I think sometimes there's a temptation to look at people and to look at athletes and kind of say to yourself, they either have it or they don't. They're either born with it or they don't have it. That attitude, that fearlessness, that competitive intensity we're talking about, like they're either born with it or they don't have it. I think there's a temptation to think that way sometimes. And I do think there's a certain amount of truth to that. I was listening one time to the professional wrestler, WWE professional wrestler Bret the Hitman Hart, and he was given his Hall of Fame induction speech, and he said something that really caught my ear. He said, "This sport is less about what you learn and more about what you have inside right from the beginning," and that kind of caught my ear, because it kind of goes along with the idea that whatever you're born with and whatever you bring to the table at the beginning, that's what you have, and that's what really matters. Because that kind of contradicts the idea that coaching is important. Because as a coach, you want to say to yourself that if a person doesn't have the right mentality, and if they don't have the right attitude, and if they don't have the right like kind of personality for this, you want to believe that you can build that, and you want to believe that you can develop that. And the thing is, I actually think you can. I always, one of the reasons I think that is because of my own personality. When I started, fear was never a problem for me. That's for sure as an athlete. But one of the things that was a problem for me was just ability to like manage just anger and intensity and aggressiveness and stuff. I was too over the top. I was too, just too insane as an athlete. Hard to manage. And I paid the price in the early years with a lot of bad performances, a lot of 2 for 6 days, a lot of bomb outs that had nothing to do with physical ability. They were all about mental ability, and it had nothing to do with fear. It just had to do with me just needing to pull my head out of my ass and learn how to like effectively manage my mind and my personality in competition. And here's the thing, I did learn, and I did change, and I did develop. And after 5 years of doing this sport, I was a different person than I was the first year that I did it. So I know from personal experience, and also because of the fact that I've coached for 20 years and I've seen this happen and watched it happen with athletes also, myself as a coach, people can absolutely develop and change and become something different inside over time in this sport. Now, when it comes to fear, getting an athlete to overcome fear, I think one of the big things that goes into that is making sure that in the early years, early days, months and years of this athlete's career, that they're managed in a way that gives them just lots and lots of success. They have a lot of 5 for 6 days and a lot of 6 for 6 days. They have a lot of competitions where they go out and make a lot of lifts, That's why, when I coach athletes, when I coach weightlifters, especially beginners, it's very, very common for their early meets, the first couple of years that they compete, to always be like 5 for 6 or 6 for 6 competitions, because I set up their competition attempts with weights that I know they're going to make. Because I know that after a lifter has spent 2 or 3 years going to meets and always making 5 attempts or 6 attempts, they're just going to start to believe that that's what they've got inside. They're just going to, they're going to become the kind of athlete who thinks like, oh yeah, I make 5 or 6 attempts. That's what I always do at my meets. And I think that can just as equally happen in the wrong direction. I used to coach a youth lifter, really, really talented youth lifter. She was on the youth world team, and she was, 14, 15, 16 years old. And she told me about when she went to a training camp with a bunch of other youth lifters. She was sitting down one day talking to them and just kind of chit-chatting. And, they were all kind of telling her how impressed they were because she always made 5 attempts at her meets and 6 attempts at their meets and stuff. And 2 or 3 of them said like, yeah, we only make like 2 at ours. These were young kids who had already that was what they just believed about weightlifting. Hey, you go to meets, you're going to make a couple of attempts. You're going to make 2 or 3. That's what they learned, And did any of that have anything to do with fear? Well, yeah, probably. I mean, because fear makes you flinch, and when you flinch during an Olympic lift, you're going to miss it. So I think that setting up, if you have a fearful athlete, I think setting up their training so that they have a lot of successful competitions and they have kind of continued progress is the best you can do. And then it's the best you can do. At the end of the day, coaching is always a little overrated. It's an athlete's they're either going to make it or they're not going to, and it's going to depend on what they have personally.
Yeah, I actually had a very interesting conversation with Danny Camargo a couple days ago about the responsibility that a coach should assume from the success or failure of an athlete. And I think oftentimes a coach, like you mentioned earlier in the podcast, feels entirely responsible for failure. And then for the success, it's the athlete's success. And I think it's about managing maybe the percentage that you give to yourself and that you give to an athlete. A good friend of mine, Ray Everest, said that he always aims to be the 49%. So out of the 100% of that relationship, he's the lower part of it, or the smaller portion of it. And I think that's important to remind yourself. And I don't know if you feel the same way, but kind of aiming to be that 49 or lower percentage will kind of help you not only protect your ego, but allow you to reassure the athlete that it's more in their hands and they have control over their destiny.
Yeah, I think those comments are absolutely right. I coached football for a long time, and we had a running joke with football coaches. The joke was players win and coaches lose, and the idea there is when you win a game, it's because, man, these are just great kids. Man, they do a great job. And when you lose a game, it's the coach's fault. Yeah. That's the conversation that goes along with that. And there's a little bit of that with weightlifting. I think as a coach, you've always got to, your first instinct always has to be to look at yourself as the answer and to blame yourself for failure. That's what makes this a hard job. I mean, it makes it a hard life because you're gonna put that on yourself. But I think you have to be a great coach. I don't think there are any great coaches out there who don't put their athletes' failures on themselves and take it personally and think it's their fault if their athletes do poorly. But the thing is, it's like, and this is where having been a weightlifter yourself comes into it pretty big time, because, when I look, okay, so I'm a coach, and when my athletes do badly, I think it's my fault, right? That's how I look at it. But then, I always have to look at things, and I always have to look back at my own career, and I have to think to myself, like, the bad performances and bomb outs that I had in my career, were any of those my coach's fault? I mean, look, I asked myself just honestly, legitimately, were any of those my coach's fault? And the answer is always no. I didn't get the job done that day. I look back and I know for a fact that it wasn't because of my coach. I didn't go out there and get the job done. And at the end of the day, that's the story. That's the true story. When athletes fail, with some very rare exceptions, because of maybe just, you've got occasional situations of just like really blatant coaching mismanagement, which can happen. I think most of the time, if an athlete goes out there and has a bad performance, it's because the athlete just didn't get it done that day. They didn't do their job that day. And as a coach, there's a balancing act, mentally inside. There's a balancing act you go through as a coach, because you're trying to put responsibility on yourself so that you always have the pressure on yourself to do a better job of coaching. But then the balancing act is always remembering that, it's not everything in the world is about you.
Agreed. Very insightful. And out of curiosity, I've noticed a trend, and I've spoken with coaches that have kind of reinforced this idea, but I'll speak with female coaches and they'll talk about having an all-male team, and I'll speak with male coaches and they have like an entire female team. Out of your experiences, what do you think the role of coaching and gender plays? Like, is there a difference between the genders and how they respond to coaching? Is there a way you approach maybe a female that's different than a way you approach a male athlete? I guess if you can kind of give us some insight into the coaching of each different gender and why there's that natural affinity towards the opposite.
Yeah. I don't think that there's a ton of difference between coaching women and men. In terms of technique, development, the physical programming and stuff like that, I don't think there's any difference. I think the difference is when it comes to programming and things like that. I think the things you have to keep in mind are the differences in size and body weight. You're going to have to train a lighter lifter a lot differently than you train a heavyweight lifter. But I don't think gender really factors into it. Now, the other stuff, the coaching, the personality, the mental coaching, the kind of athlete management, if you want to put it that way. I think there are some differences in regards to that. I think one of the differences, when you coach female athletes, when they fail, when they have moments of failure, when they underperform, they're usually going to be the first ones to be beating themselves up inside, and they're going to be probably doing it a lot worse than it even looks like on the outside. And so I think if you're a coach, you have to kind of remember that, because you can't really, go and start beating them over the head yourself as a coach, because they're already, kicking their own ass inside, my experience coaching women has been that, if they do badly, and if they fail, you've always got to have that, you're okay, it's all right, you're going to do well. Here's and not just saying like little platitudes like that. Oh, it's going to be okay, but actually giving them useful input about what they need to do to fix it. But with female athletes, I found there's a lot of self-torture inside, that you have to kind of try as a coach not to make it any worse. With guys, sometimes it's different. Now some guys are like that. They kind of beat themselves up and torture themselves inside. I was one of those. If I failed or if I performed badly, the last thing I needed was a coach piling it on me and reminding me or kind of verbally, attacking me about how bad I did, because I was already just ripping myself apart inside anyway. I needed somebody to I hate to sound like too touchy-feely about it, but kind of, put their arm around me and say like, hey, you're going to be okay. You're going to make it through this, because I kind of needed that. But a lot of times with guys, they're going to be lazy. They're going to be entitled. If they do badly, they're going to they're not going to torture themselves inside, because they're going to have that like, whatever, bro, I'm still awesome kind of thought. Sometimes you got to kick them in the ass. You got to make sure that they don't, kind of get away with that. Like I said, I was a football coach for a long time. In football, you've basically got to threaten players with death to get them to perform. They've got to know every second of every practice that if they screw up or do badly, that you're going to make them run until they're like puking their guts out in the hospital. They've got to live in fear. And sometimes guys are like that. You've got to kind of keep the heat on them, and you got to kind of you got to be willing to give them an ass ripping that maybe you wouldn't give to a female, and these things are all individuals. I mean, I've coached females who, they need to get their ass ripped just as much as a guy would, and they respond well when they do, so, I think there's a million different variations of this, and you've also got to remember that no qualities are kind of like, unilateral by gender. I mean, like everybody's different inside. And so it's more just about knowing how to manage the person, regardless of their gender, but I also think that, nowadays, when it comes to coaching gender, I think, and this is, there's kind of goods and bads to this. The whole ideas of, appropriateness and, appropriate words and appropriate contact and appropriate, conduct are really important, because, 25 years ago, it was just the wild, wild west when it came to that stuff. But it's different now. And so as a coach, I think you've really got to be, you really got to have a very sharpened level of professionalism, when it comes to doing your job.
Yeah. And I'm sure, as with people listening, as with myself, I hear what you're saying, and my mind's immediately going to a situation or a person where I've seen that firsthand. And so I couldn't agree more, obviously. And Matt, that's it for the formal questions. I do have one last question that kind of helps with the philosophical aspect of the podcast, because most of it is just focused on weightlifting. But the last question is, what is one thing that people can do each day to become a better person?
One thing that people can do each day to become a better person. The first answer that pops into my head is, I would say, spend your days finding little ways to do good things for other people. Even if it just means small, demonstrations of respect and courtesy, at a gas station or a grocery store or something like that. As a weightlifter or a coach, contributing to other people. If you're an athlete, contributing positively to your gym atmosphere and to your coach's life, and helping others and supporting others, and doing things that are going to make other people feel good and feel more enthusiastic and feel more positive about their lives. And as a coach, that's the job. I mean, that's the job requirement. But I think every day, kind of continuously throughout your day, kind of finding a way to live your life in a way that makes it clear that you don't think you're the most important person in the world, and you don't think you're the only person in the world, and that everybody you come across in your daily life, they've got their own life, and their own life is important to them, and their own life is just as important as yours. And so thinking about those people and constantly having a sense of giving and contributing and helping others and supporting others, even if it's people you don't know and you're going to see them for 5 seconds and never see them again, kind of constantly having that attitude, I think that's the way, philosophically, whether it sounds corny or not, I think that's the way the world's supposed to work and how it needs to work, because as we continue to move forward as a society, everything's going in a different direction than that. Everything's getting more selfish and more self-focused and more and less concerned with helping other people and more concerned about celebrating the self. And maybe that's not right for me to say that. Maybe it's just an old guy, being cranky about the way the world's changing. But I'm not entirely convinced that I'm completely wrong about it. And so I think every single day, making sure that your entire day is about treating others well, and obviously, prioritizing correctly and making sure that you're taking care of your own things and doing what you need to do to make your own life better, but never letting that be the only thing you think about throughout the day.
Yeah, and if our listeners haven't read any of your articles over at Catalyst Athletics, I would definitely recommend checking that out, because one comes to mind. I actually just finished reading it. You were talking about your time boxing at a certain gym and how someone would come in and greet everyone and say goodbye to everyone. And that kind of resonates with me, is that's how I want to operate when I get into the gym. I want to say hi to everyone, say bye to everyone, just try and spread some type of positivity into that environment. And then when I leave, also do the same. But because people take that experience with them when they do leave, and maybe you notice that with future interactions, how they're a little more friendly, and then suddenly a relationship develops out of that. And it's just going out of your way to make sure people are included and feel like someone cares for them. Even, that sounds a little corny, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. So I think that was actually a really great article. So guys, go check that out.
I appreciate that. And it's also, if you want to look at it from a different perspective, it's also the best way to recruit.
Yeah.
The best way you can recruit as a coach is to be good to people. Because I can tell you for sure that the coaches that have made a difference in my life, they were great coaches, and they were good at their craft and everything like that. But it was more about just the fact that I knew they cared about me and I cared about them, and we kind of mutually wanted the best for each other. So yeah, I completely agree with that.
Okay, and Matt, as we finish up, you have books you've written, you have all of the articles. So where can you direct people, or where should we direct people if they'd like to buy your books and check those out? Because you've written about masters weightlifting, you have a book with a bunch of your articles that you've written. You have the book that recently came out about drug use and weightlifting. So where should we direct people to go check those resources out?
CatalystAthletics.com is that's kind of our home base. That's all my books are there, all my articles are there. Everything I've ever written in weightlifting is there. So Catalyst Athletics is the place to go. I'm also on Amazon. My books are on Amazon. Olympic Weightlifting for Masters, Bones of Iron, and Drugs in Olympic Weightlifting. Those are all Amazon and Catalyst. Both of those are good places to find them.
Okay, and do you have a gym you coach out of right now?
Yeah, I'm coaching people at a gym called Core CrossFit. It's in Phoenix, downtown Phoenix, Arizona. Yeah, that's kind of like my home base where I'm working.
Okay, well, I mean, we don't have that many people that listen to the podcast, but if you happen to be in the Phoenix area or in Arizona, go check out that gym and go say hi to Matt and get some coaching. Matt, thanks again for coming on the show. I'm sure people appreciate it, as do I. Is very insightful, and it's always a pleasure learning from someone with the immense experience that you have.
Yeah, well, thanks, Josh. I appreciate it. And your questions are all right on the money. When I do a lot of these things, and you can tell sometimes from the questions if the person's got the right just set of ideas about weightlifting, and yours are right on the money.
Well, I really appreciate it. And everyone, go check out Matt Foreman's content. If you like the podcast, like, share, subscribe, leave a review, positive or negative. It all helps support the podcast. And once again, thanks for listening to this episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.